right, now we're going to talk about funding for priorities to advance 30 by 30 in coastal waters. Next slide, please. So California's 30 by 30 initiative seeks to create and expand enduring conservation measures across a broad range of seascapes. This effort drives and aligns with broader state commitments to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion and strengthen tribal partnerships. Next slide, please. OPC will solicit proposals in 3 priority areas. Overall, these investments in science, restoration, and stewardship will strengthen and advance biodiversity in state coastal waters and advance the state's 30 by 30 initiative. OPC will support work that occurs in designated or potential 30 by 30 conservation areas, and we will work with project applicants to ensure that the project outcomes aligns with the final decision-making framework when adopted. OPC will also support work outside of 30 by 30 conservation areas where such work can be considered a complementary conservation measure per pathways. In other words, actions that will not quantified within a 30 by 30 acreage target are essential to long-term conservation success. All right, let's look into each priority. Next slide, please. The first priority is action-oriented science, and we intend to allocate $2 million for this. However, I will make the note that these funding allocations may shift depending on the application received under each funding priority. This priority builds upon the recommendations from Appendix E to the Pathways Report, Science Needs for Advancing Coastal Waters, 30 by 30. California's coastal and marine ecosystems currently face a multitude of threats, including more frequent and more intense disturbances, sea level rise, ocean acidification, marine disease, invasive species, pollution, and in some cases, overharvest of marine resources. To effectively conserve 30% of coastal waters by 2030, the state requires an improved understanding of how these threats are currently impacting biodiversity and how their intensity and distribution may change in the future. As OPC moves through the evaluation of candidate areas, research to address science and knowledge gaps will both support the evaluation of current and the identification of future conservation priorities for 30 by 30, in addition to advancing many of OPC's strategic plan goals. Research findings will also improve the conservation outcomes of 30 by 30 conservation areas. Next slide, please. Priority number 2 is expanding and accelerating local environmental restoration and stewardship, and we intend to allocate $4 million for this. This priority is informed by Pathway 6 from the Pathways to 30 by 30 report. And safeguarding California's biodiversity for decades to come will not be achieved by simply protecting intact habitats. So restoring and stewarding ecosystem functions across a broad array of coastal and marine habitats, including increasing connectivity between these habitats, is essential to help imperiled species recover and enable ecosystems to thrive even amidst climate change. Next slide, please. Our third priority is restoring and revitalizing tribally led stewardship, and we intend to allocate $4 million for this priority area. These awards will solely go to tribes and nonprofits working directly with tribes. This investment comes as part of OPC's commitments made in our tribal engagement strategy to support tribally led stewardship and uplift tribal knowledges and expertise. A key conservation priority for California's 30 by 30 initiative is improving California Native American tribes' connection, ownership, stewardship, and uses of ancestral and traditional areas that are central not only to tribal identity and sovereignty, but also biodiversity protection and ecosystem function. 30 by 30 aims to develop meaningful and mutually beneficial opportunities for tribal management and co-management within coastal watersheds and marine waters. Next slide, please. So pending council approval to disperse funds to advance these 3 priorities, we anticipate releasing a request for proposals in January 2025 with letters of intent due in February and final proposals in March 2025. For funding priority 3, restoring and revitalizing tribal-led stewardship, final proposals will also be accepted until July 2025, providing additional time and flexibility for tribal applicants. Proposals will undergo a structured competitive review process led by OPC. Projects selected through this review process will be brought to the council for funding consideration of grant awards for all 3 priorities at the June 2025 council meeting and the September 2025 council meeting for projects received under funding priority 3, tribal projects, that applied at the second deadline offered in July. Following council approval of the grant awards, the anticipated start date of selected projects are anticipated in fall and winter 2025. The duration of project requested is anticipated to be 2 years, although requests for 1-year awards is highly encouraged. And next slide, please. Thank you so much for the update, and Ann and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Good afternoon. Keith Rutzart. I'm with the Giant Kelp Restoration Project in Monterey. And at the April 2023 meeting, I asked you if the $5.4 million in funding for accelerating kelp restoration and restoration efforts was available for kelp restoration and research. We were told the restoration could be definitely funded. But when I submitted letters of interest and a full application, the Sea Grant reviewers asked me, where's your control? I attended a grant webinar and asked if we needed to obtain permission before applying for a grant. We were assured we did not need permission at the time that we applied. But then the Sea Grant reviewer said, well, you don't have permission. The last funding opportunity gave us a great optimism, and we made an honest attempt to engage with OPC because the funding seemed aimed right at our grassroots restoration organization. But we learned that OPC prefers to do research and not restoration. Real kelp restoration efforts in Monterey by concerned volunteer divers at Tankers Reef were stopped, in large part because of a joint letter from OPC urging the Fish and Game Commission to kill an 11-acre kelp forest for the sake of scientific research. Kelp restoration is not permitted anywhere in California, only research. So this agenda item includes $4 million for watershed scale restoration and also kelp restoration, which you really don't permit inside or outside of marine protected areas. So I ask you to please don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And let's learn by doing. Another one of your key points. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And as we move, to public comment online, I think at least some of those comments may be most relevantly addressed in the next item regarding the disbursement of funds to support adaptive management and resilience of kelp forests. So I'm going to put a pin in public comment, but ask colleagues to respond during the next agenda item. We're going to move on to our final action item of the meeting. Keep in mind that the following item after this is an opportunity for public comment on non-agenda items. But this is an important action item because it addresses the resilience of our kelp forests, which has been a topic of priority over the last several years. And this is an action item to consider and potentially approve disbursement of funding to support adaptive management and resilience of kelp forests. And we're joined by our colleague, Pike Spector, who is Biodiversity Program Manager. And I believe we'll also be joined by Tristan Anush McHugh, who's the Kelp Project Director of the Nature Conservancy. So I'll turn it over to you, Pike.
Great. Thank you so much, Chair Crowfoot. Again, my name is Pike Spector. I am the Biodiversity Program Manager, and I'm thrilled to be joined virtually by the Nature Conservancy's Kelp Project Director, Tristan Anush McHugh. Tristan has shown incredible leadership on California's North Coast, leading in-water restoration efforts up there, and she's here to present today as the PI on her funded work under the Accelerating Kelp Research Program. So next slide, and it's yours, Tristan.
Welcome, Tristan.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We sure can.
Okay, excellent. Let's do it. Good afternoon, Council. My name is Tristan Anush McHugh. I'm the Kelp Project Director with the Nature Conservancy, and I'm honored to be here today to provide an update to the Council 1 year following approval for the Big River Kelp Recovery Project in coastal Mendocino County. Next. Our project has 3 objectives. 1, in-water kelp recovery by strategically implementing our best techniques. 2, investigate urchin fishery adaptation to effectively direct kelp restoration efforts. And 3, ensure long-term ecosystem stewardship through experience and connection. And today I will share this program's year 1 outcomes, noting that it builds on years of learning, also made possible by previous OPC and match investments. Next. At the core of our work, a refugio location that survived the great losses between 2014 and 2019, part of the surviving 4% has experienced an 84% decrease in kelp canopy in the past 2 years, with 2023 being the most drastic decline. Next. As such, our prescribed treatment for this recently deforested location is twofold: to suppress native purple urchin grazers and catalyze vegetative recovery via kelp enhancement. Next. We began with a targeted urchin harvest along the kelp edges, for example, blocks 1, 2, 3, 12, to facilitate a spillover effect from adjacent forests. Then in areas furthest from kelp, like 9 and 10, we prescribed a treatment of both grazer suppression and kelp enhancement. Next. In 2024, commercial urchin divers harvested 27 tons of purple urchin from restoration sites. And 6 vessels, 12 divers, contributed to over 500 underwater hours and provided a substantial opportunity to the urchin fishery. Next. Amazingly, we did see that natural spillover. Within 2 months of grazer suppression, the forest grew, became reproductive, and expanded. Next. And this is further corroborated in our 2024 kelp canopy maps, where you can see we were able to protect and expand remnant kelp. And there's even more underwater beneath the surface. And now pivoting to our kelp enhancement efforts. Next. Building on years of learning, this year we piloted novel archive modules to accelerate kelp recovery. Next. This is an archive module. Kelps were sliced into the line at the surface and simply tossed off the boat. Next.
Tristan, we couldn't hear you speaking over the video, so you may want to just tell us what we just saw.
Okay, great. That was an archive module at deployment where juvenile kelps were spliced into the line there and simply tossed off a boat. And that is the unit underwater. And next slide, please. Same may happen. Maybe not. This is 1 month later, and these kelps have become new habitat for baby and adult rockfish with over 10 different associated species accounted for, an incredible biodiversity gain. Next. And then lastly, it's with great pleasure to report that by the month 2 of deployment, the owl-planted kelp became reproductive, and we're dropping spores all over the restoration site, giving hope for a forest to emerge on the seafloor next spring. Next. Next year, we'll be continuing urchin harvest and scaling up our kelp enhancement activities to put more vegetation in the system, and we will continue monitoring. Next. Next, please. Thank you. In Objective 3, this is community enrichment through meaningful hands-on experience. Next. To start, 5 local interns participated in kelp recovery efforts of Objective 1, everything I just shared with you. They had hands-on experience to further prepare a climate-ready workforce. Next. In addition to further engage non-diving community members, this year we launched the first ever Kelp Fest to elevate other ways of knowing and stewarding this invaluable ecosystem through art. Next. Science. Next. Food. Next. And film. All events sold out with over 1,500 participants registered for the month-long event. We are now planning for the 2025 Kelp Fest. Next. Lastly, our recovery program aims to build back biodiversity of seaweeds and the hundreds of species that depend on them for food and habitat. As such, we are combining art and science to create a visual record that captures changes in biodiversity over time as a tangible way to communicate our results. Next. Lastly, I would like to thank the council again for their support as we strive to accelerate the pace and scale of this invaluable coastal habitat. I thank all my collaborators, and I am happy to answer any questions now or in the future. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tristan. I did want to point out that I got to attend Kelp Fest this year. It was amazing to see so much community support and buy-in for the restoration efforts happening on the North Coast, which has been severely impacted by the loss of canopy-forming kelp.
And just so we can build anticipation, when does Kelp Fest occur in the time of year? When will it occur in 2025?
Yes, thanks for asking. October, first week of October 2025 is what we're shooting for. Firming up dates. We'll let you know.
And is it I'm saying this because I want to come. Is it Mendocino or Humboldt?
Yes, this is all in Mendocino. Not a lot of happenings around kelp in our area, and this was like a huge draw. So yes, it'll be in Mendocino County. It'll include Fort Bragg community as well as Mendocino.
Got it. Thank you.
Amazing. All right, great. Thank you so much. Let's get to it. Next slide, please. You already know who I am now. Great. OPC's current strategic plan highlights the need to restore and protect kelp forest ecosystems, which requires funding, supporting, and coordinating cutting-edge research projects that fill knowledge gaps and aid in the adaptive management of these iconic underwater forests. Next slide, please. None of you are strangers to the kelp crisis that has been occurring on our coast. The Ocean Protection Council and the state of California has taken bold action in recent years to address the alarming declines in kelp forest ecosystems, which has led towards the development of the Kelp Restoration and Management Plan. I am here today to recommend two projects that will advance the KRMP, specifically by addressing key components of this novel plan, a harvest framework and the restoration toolkit. Next slide, please. This first project, assessing commercial and recreational harvest impact on giant and bull kelp in California, directly informs the development of a harvest framework by creating the first ever quantitative model of the impacts that harvest may have on these canopy-forming kelps. Kelp is harvested as an important source of feed for aquaculture species, and compounds derived from kelps are used in a suite of commercial and pharmaceutical applications. The Department of Fish and Wildlife leases beds along our coast for kelp harvest. Giant kelp can be harvested mechanically by boat from the surface down to about 1 meter. Bull kelp, conversely, can only be harvested by hand, which usually involves the mortality of the individual. So the department can issue closures based on the abundance of canopy kelp. And in 2022, the Department of Fish and Wildlife closed the harvest of bull kelp in Mendocino and Sonoma counties due to that catastrophic kelp loss until at least early 2026. So what impact does harvest have on the recovery and resilience of canopy-forming kelps in California and the ecosystems they support? Next slide, please. To address this vital question, researchers from the Woods Hole Institution of Oceanography will create the first ever assessment of the impacts that commercial and recreational harvest may have on kelp forests. They will use historic and current satellite imagery and remote sensing tools to create this relationship. I'd like to point out that there are differences in anatomy between giant and bull kelp, which makes it really hard to assess their biomass above and below the surface. However, this project will create the first ever mathematical relationship to quickly and easily measure the biomass and the resulting impacts that canopy harvest may have. Results from this project will provide marine managers with the tools necessary to understand harvest impacts on giant and bull kelp and ecosystem resilience and recovery, and integrate directly into the KRMP's restoration toolkit and inform the harvest framework. Next slide, please. As we work towards implementing the KRMP, we have been focusing on the restoration toolkit. Yet, as we work towards restoring kelp forest communities, there are a number of unanswered questions around resilience and recovery. If we are to ensure that the forests that we're restoring are durable and resilient in the face of climate change, we need to understand the role that genomics plays in conferring resilience. And in this case, genomics is simply the complete genetic diversity within an individual. So here it's individual giant or bull kelps. And we suspect that high genomic diversity facilitates greater resilience and recovery from emergent threats, such as marine heat waves, disease, and increased storm intensity. However, these questions haven't been answered in the context of our current restoration efforts. Next slide, please. To understand the role that genomic diversity may play in conferring resilience in giant and bull kelp, researchers
Okay. I feel safe. Safer.
What a relief. What a relief. Now we can get back to addressing the real elephant in the room.
Thank you.
Researchers from the University of California, Santa Cruz will create a novel geospatial database of resilient kelp, giant and bull kelp populations on our coast using historic data and previously funded projects, and will create a novel genomic diversity layer to help us understand which populations have higher and lower genomic diversity. They will then lead field campaigns at priority locations identified by OPC and CDFW staff for tissue sampling to, again, get a better understanding of what genomic diversity looks like in our resilient kelp populations. Through this iterative process, we will gain a comprehensive understanding of the state of genomic diversity, which will directly inform the development of the Kelp Restoration and Management Plan's restoration toolkit and inform future restoration success. Next slide, please. OPC staff recommend dispersing $775,000 to support adaptive management and resilience in kelp forests. $250,000 will support the first ever assessment of commercial and recreational harvest impact on giant and bull kelp. $525,000 will support strategic mapping of genomic diversity of giant and bull kelp. Both of these projects fill critical knowledge gaps and advance our efforts to protect, restore, understand, and manage these iconic ecosystems in the face of an ever-changing climate. Next slide, please. Thank you for your consideration. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Many thanks, Pike. I have a question or set of questions, but let's move to public comment now. And for anybody who's joining us in person, please come to the front. Anyone on Zoom, please click the raise your hand, and anyone by phone, #2. Hello.
My name is Keith Rutzar. I'm with the Giant Kelp Restoration Project. And kelp first began 32 million years ago, but in the last 2.6 million years, it's evolved into what we recognize today. The entire west coast of North America was dominated by giant kelp forests, with sea otters predating on invertebrates and sea cows predating on kelp. The stellar sea cow evolved to be big and buoyant, and herds of those manatees grazed in the kelp beds. Eating the kelp canopy allows sunlight to penetrate deeper into the water, and giant kelp recruits into the light. When a kelp stipe is trimmed, it sends up another stipe, making it thicker and more resilient. In Monterey, we have lost most of our kelp forests. What kelp remains along Canterbury Row is where the Monterey Abalone Company has coincidentally harvested kelp for the last 30 years. Kelp harvesting is essential to that resilience, and acts as a proxy for the now extinct sea cow. In our 2023 MPA petition to the Fish and Game Commission, we are asking to allow the kelp canopy pruning and planting in coordination with kelp restoration efforts. The ocean is getting warmer, and marine heat waves are more often and more intense, and kelp makes tissues from carbon dioxide, which is less soluble in warmer water, and the southern range of kelp is becoming tropical and maybe just too warm for kelp. The southern range of the kelp is just way too warm. I've been down in Baja California, and it's warm there, right? Over the last 30 years in Monterey, we started seeing fish from Southern California, and we are starting to even see lobsters. Now, genetic diversity evaluation of kelp is a great idea. We should also try to plant kelp from the south, in the north, and see if it survives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's move to virtual public comment.
We have Kirsten Ramey. Kirsten, you are unmuted and have the floor. Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me?
We sure can.
Okay. Thank you, Secretary Crowfoot, council members, and OPC staff. My name is Kirsten Ramey. I'm an environmental program manager for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Marine Region. I'll keep my comments short, as we did provide a written comment letter. I just want to reiterate that the department supports the disbursement of funds by the Ocean Protection Council on this action item for the adaptive management and resilience of kelp forests. As Pike mentioned, we are in the process of developing the kelp restoration and management plan in partnership with OPC. It will include both giant and bull kelp. These two projects will directly inform the development of the management plan and will help facilitate a robust, adaptive, climate-ready approach to managing California's kelp forest ecosystems in the face of changing ocean conditions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for the partnership of the Department of Fish and Wildlife with OPC. Are there any other public comments?
There's no further public comment.
Great. So just starting off on a comment and a question, you know, if I'm thinking about the last five years on the Ocean Protection Council, there's probably no greater crisis or challenge that has been sort of a through line of our work than the collapse of the kelp forests. To me, it's the sort of largest environmental crisis very few people know about. And the number I recall is well over 90% of large portions of our kelp forests are gone. And as it's been described or explained to me, or at least as I recall being educated, so much of it has to do with the sea star wasting disease and the loss of the sea star predator on the purple urchin and the creation of these urchin barrens. So I really appreciate the fact that we've got a kelp management plan and an action plan. And it seems like so much of the crux of our funding and focus has been how do we address this ecosystem imbalance with these urchin barrens. And so the first presentation from the Nature Conservancy seems to get right at that question. So Pike, I'm interested in terms of where is the state of our work, and is the science pointing to broader practices to manage and sort of reduce the urchin barrens? And then I guess the question related to that is these are two separate research questions that are now being asked. The impact of the harvesting of kelp, which seems important to answer, as well as the genomic diversity. Those seem important, but also not at the crux of this question around the urchin barrens. So I want you to, if you would, make the case for this funding while we continue to address what seems like the core threat to the kelp.
Yeah, thank you for your question and for your comments, Chair Crowfoot. I would like to acknowledge your leadership in helping us advance the development of the kelp restoration and management plan and the kelp action plan, which really paved the way for letting us get this important work done. Sort of traditionally in the Western science approach to understanding the kelp state, we think about the urchin barren as being this alternate stable state where you're either kelp dominated or you're urchin dominated. And what we want to see in a balanced ecosystem is a prolific, understory of macroalgae with those giant kelp or the bull kelp canopy and plenty of urchins in cracks and crevices. However, there's actually a lot of places where kelp is totally denuded and urchins aren't to blame. So the issues facing kelp forest decline are multifaceted, and I understand that these two projects don't solve all of our problems, but they help us understand the kelp state a little bit more, and especially how humans interact with that kelp state. So that the harvest impact basically gives us the tools, with the state of California and marine managers, the tools to understand what sustainable harvest of kelp looks like. And it should be noted that also includes tribal harvest as well. It's just that mechanical harvest of giant kelp in Southern California was really a driving factor in the sort of first part of the 20th century, and bull kelp hand harvest it's just a different approach. So we're trying to get our heads around that. And recreational harvest is important for a suite of home uses, right? Like composting and eating and things like that. So that helps us understand what our targets are for restoration and where we're going with a thriving kelp state in California. And the genomic diversity question, again, helps us understand how kelp forests are changing along our coast. And I don't really want to put my foot in my mouth or get ahead of myself, but I think it does directly inform future outplanting and enhancement projects. Tristan's project with the Nature Conservancy up in Mendocino shows us the results from today's presentation are quite compelling, that a multifaceted approach to restoration may be the most effective. This is our learn by doing approach. So I think we're getting there, we still have a lot of lessons to learn, but the development of the restoration toolkit and the harvest framework really do advance our ecosystem-based management approach for the kelp restoration and management plan.
That's helpful, thank you. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, just to add, thank you so much for that, Pike. That was perfect. I just wanted to put a finer point on your question, Chair, and that is, you know, we are investing in these efforts to remove purple urchin and see the efficacy and the level of effort and the cost effectiveness of doing those projects. So the previous investments that this council has made are really helping us answer those questions. So it's really, how do we balance this portfolio approach to making sure our kelp forests are resilient into the future and using the best and most cost-effective techniques. So we're still trying to answer those questions. And, you know, those 27 tons of urchin that were removed, we're now looking to see, okay, well, what is the kelp gonna do once we've pulled those out? And does it mean we can use less effort to maintain that? And what's sustainable over time?
And is it still, have we still not found a commercial use for the purple urchin? Isn't that sort of the tragedy here, is that we have this,
There are inroads into the potential application. I don't know that it's necessarily our role, the Ocean Protection Council, as staff of the OPC, to drive that, but I am curious about projects to urchin ranch, which is effectively fattening up those starving purple urchins and then market them. I think there's been relative success with other urchin species around the world. California is not the only place facing this problem, so actually, we might see some more interesting narratives come out of next year's Kelp Fest. I poked my head into an urchin dyeing project where they were using the crushed tests of purple urchins to dye scarves and textiles, and it's a novel and innovative approach. It may not solve the crisis, but it is nice to see some application that is tangible and is a good educational tool as well.
fascinating. Megan?
I just have a question, because I do recall we approved a suite of projects, right, that went through a competitive process. So were these just sort of like gaps in sort of that understanding that either OPC or CDFW identified that are now going to be filled with these projects? Is that my understanding?
Yes, that's exactly right. So the development of the harvest assessment came out of other projects that we funded with the PIs and with the tools that they already use. Mm-hmm. And so the questions started coming out of, hey, how do we get our heads around this? And so that was a very iterative conversation as this is a glaring gap that we need to fill. Mm-hmm. And the genomic diversity question has been keeping me up at night, as well as my colleagues at the Department of Fish and Wildlife, as we work towards developing that restoration toolkit. We just kept sort of spinning our wheels, like, where are we going with this? Mm-hmm. What does a durable and resilient restored kelp forest look like in climate change? And that genomic question is just, it's keeping us up at night.
Okay, thank you.
From my view, Megan's asking really good questions about our process and sort of the decisions we make. And so what differentiates a sort of a pot of money that gets, you do an RFP and put out a competitive, solicitation, and then you have other entities competing against each other versus identifying, sole source entity to do certain research?
I'm going to take this one. Thank you. I think in this particular case and in other situations similar to this is really a good example of our strong partnership with our sister agencies, right? So we've been working really closely with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, who's the lead in managing kelp ecosystems, and this was identified by them as a critical need to successfully manage this resource. And so in many cases, like the 30 by 30 item you just considered, we can identify a broad range of needs, and then we want to hear the best ideas. This instance was one that was identified as a key and urgent need to fill a gap so that we can move forward with the kelp restoration and management plan.
Thank you for asking my question more directly.
Yeah, no, it's, well, your question made me curious. But I think that is really helpful because we have so many partners, and so it's good to understand how we make decisions to competitively solicit versus make a strategic recommendation like this.
Yeah, and I'll just say it's really great, the collaboration between CDFW and OPC staff, so it's great to see.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm really, I'm quite passionate about, us continuing to do all that we can on this, so appreciate what you're doing. We have a proposed action in front of us, and that is to move to adopt proposed findings for all projects as recommended by staff and approve those projects. Is there a motion on the floor?
So moved.
Okay, the controller, 4 for 4, 5 for 5. Looks like.
Come on.
I got it, I'll second.
Okay.
Seconded by Megan. Roll call, please.
Chair Crowfoot,
Yes.
Katie Landau,
Yes.
Controller Cohen,
Aye.
Megan Rocha.
Yes.
And again, my name is Keith Rutzart. I'm with the Giant Kelp Restoration Project. And I have restored kelp in Monterey 4 times with volunteers. First one I did at Lover's Cove, we did it for 2 years, and we had 20 target sites that we went to every few weeks, and we reduced the prescription of urchins on there, and I grew 1 kelp. And that was it. And it was on our lowest density target. And then at Tanker's Reef, we had a big existing kelp forest, and we worked in it. We removed all these urchins, and the kelp forest grew over time. But then we had to go work on the grid, and so we lost that kelp forest. But we grew another one on the grid, the treatment area where everyone's been studying. And so that grew. And then we had to stop that. And now that kelp forest is being eaten again. But we did try to go to the east of that site and try and restore some more urchins. And we just discovered that there's kelp there now. Like where we had called urchins just a year ago, there's kelp back there. So it really does work, and I've done a lot of research in this. This is my 6th year of doing this kind of activity. And I think a lot of our hopes are on this kelp restoration management plan that is before the Ocean Protection Council now, and love to see that get through. If I could do anything today, put a fire under that committee, because you're not really supposed to have a result until 2027, right? And that's just way too long for what's going out here in Monterey. And we've been out of the water for a year, and we'd like to get back in. And so if I can do anything today, it would be to at least learn by doing. Do something that is not research, that gets work done in the water, because it's going to take a long time of doing things to learn what we will know in the future. So thanks again.
Thank you so much, and I think we share your urgency and appreciate that there, been aspects of our agenda that is really getting people in the water to learn by doing. So appreciate all that you do.